Hey, everybody. Welcome to Coffee and the Crusades. This is the weekly live stream for the Real Crusades History channel. Here today with a special guest from the land of coffee itself, really.
Yeah.
I believe we got Sam here with us, who is an expert on the Ottoman Empire. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about really anything anybody wants to ask about the Ottomans. This would be a good time to do that. So, yeah, I guess that is true, though, right? Sam doesn't. Were the Turks the originators of coffee itself?
Yeah, it got popular from the Turks. I mean, it's grown in Yemen, and so the Arabs in Yemen knew about it, but it becomes like a big mass market item in the Ottoman Empire in 16th century. So, yeah, I mean, that's where later the Europeans go there and they see coffee houses, and then you get coffee houses in Europe.
Yeah, so I guess I owe my coffee. I mean, I'm a major coffee person myself, so I guess I'm going to have to give a nod to the Ottomans for that. I know. I mean, when I was in Istanbul, the coffee there is really good. I mean, you can get some amazing coffee.
Yeah, there. It is. Yeah, it is really good. Yeah, I don't drink Turkish coffee here that often. Actually, mostly you drink tea here. Everybody loves tea. So, yeah, like with my colleagues at the university, when we have a break, it's always tea. But, we have coffee too.
So you mentioned that you have been working on something kind of interesting recently. You're doing something about the Siege of Rhodes from 1522.
Yeah, so I have one of the chronicles from the Ottoman, written by an Ottoman observer, I think. It's anonymous, so it's from the 1522 Siege of Rhodes, where Suleiman returns to the island to take it from the Knights Hospitaller, and they had been, because in 1480 they had been unsuccessful under a different commander, but then Suleiman comes back. So the chronicle is just a narrative of the siege. There's a few different of these kind of campaign histories of the siege, so I'm trying to work on that. I have a conference later this year that I'm going to present about this source. Oh, now I see the live chat. Sorry, I couldn't see that for a minute.
Okay, good. Yeah. You can see it to the side there. All right,
yeah.
Awesome. So let's see here. I'm going to jump over to the side here. Yeah, and if you see any questions that jump out to you, feel free to take those up. So if I will actually kind of kick us off today, because I'm actually kind of curious about this chronicle you've been working on. So what are your general thoughts about the Siege of Rhodes in 1522? Like, why was this one successful as opposed to the previous one that didn't succeed?
I think my sense is that Suleiman was pretty consistent about arming the troops with gunpowder weapons more consistently, because 1480 and 1522, I mean, that's almost 40 years of technological change. And the knights had improved a lot too. I mean, the defense of the walls of Rhodes had been really improved, but the gunpowder weapons had been improved a lot too. So my sense is that it was just the amount of weapons that they could, small gunpowder weapons that they could field, was to a larger scale than it had been in 1480. And the other thing too is the 1480 siege. It was commanded by not the Sultan, but a lower, like a pasha. And from what I was reading in the literature, that he didn't really attack the main walls head on. He tried to capture one of the smaller towers to secure the harbor. Whereas in Suleiman's siege, he just lands to take the walls directly, and that seems to have helped. But the losses on the Ottoman side were really high. I mean, it was extremely costly, and the Chronicle I have even discusses that at some length. I mean, just kind of these wasteful attacks.
And are you talking about the successful siege in 1522? There was a lot of it was like a high casualty event, or was that just the earlier one?
The successful one, yeah, the successful
Okay.
one was very high casualty in 1522.
And why do you think? Okay, so not to monopolize the questions here, but
No problem.
You mentioned that the Hospitallers had improved the fortifications, and yet they still were overcome. And I guess that was a lot of that had to do with the sheer force of the cannon available and the artillery. But do you think the Hospitallers were in a weaker position at that point in terms of just their forces? I mean, did they have a large garrison or a large force that they could deploy against the Ottomans, or was it not as sufficient as it had been previously?
I think I haven't read the European sources, but my sense is that the Hospitallers needed some kind of external support or assistance, and as far as I know, they couldn't really quite get it at that time. But I
Like
mean,
from Spain or one of the major Christian
yeah,
powers or something?
yeah. I mean, and I mean, the Hospitallers put up a pretty amazing fight, so it was still effective.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll get to some questions from some people here. Alexander's got one. Did the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire handle rebellious emirs and other aristocrats like the kings of France and Sweden did? Which I think we're getting some translation issues here, but which could at the same time during this epoch of higher centralization. Let's see. I know sometimes that when people are trying to translate from other languages, but
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I understand the question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the main difference I think you raised this point in a previous stream is how in the European feudal system, you had like let's say, I don't know, the County of Jerusalem. People recognize this as like an institution, whereas you don't really have that in the Ottoman system necessarily. I mean, you have positions that the state hands out, but you don't really have a kind of a, I should put this, like a right to it necessarily. So, if they revoke your feudatory rights to land, you have no legal authority necessarily to say, well, this isn't fair, or I have rights as a baron of this, barony, but there was always people trying to undermine the Sultan at various times. I mean, Suleiman has to deal with it. All the sultans in the classical period have to deal with what do we call local notables, because the other issue is that the areas that the Ottomans control, not everything is ruled by a Ottoman state official. A lot of it is they make a deal with a local family or local elites, and they rule indirectly, kind of that way. So I don't know. Maybe that's. I hope that answers the question for you, Alexander.
All right. And then with Xenix, we've got how important was the Ottoman Empire for the spread of gunpowder from China to the far west? Apparently, guns were in Europe already in the 13th century, but 1453 seems a key point for further adoption. Good question.
Yeah, it's kind of a big question. I think when with this kind of gunpowder weaponry, I don't think anyone really had a monopoly on it. That's just my opinion. I think the trade networks were kind of diffused enough that different people could get it at different times, and it's I don't think the Ottomans alone necessarily would have the credit there. But I mean, like the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, that was clearly won in part because Mehmed the Conqueror had the really heavy siege artillery.
That's kind of an interesting issue that I've thought about sometimes. Obviously, Constantinople is kind of considered the big moment where walled cities become somewhat irrelevant, I guess, or less important. Uh, what do you think about that, Sam? Like in terms of the Ottoman Empire itself, like at that point, were they less inclined to defend things with medieval style fortifications, or how did that change for them? Going from the 15th century into the 16th century.
Yeah, so they don't give up on fortification. It's just the fortifications change. So it's less medieval castles, and they start developing forts with like angular walls to deflect the artillery. So if you want to look this up, it's called Tres Italien style walls, and the fortifications become more kind of strong points for to field cannons from.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking at. It's called a bastion fort, also, I guess.
Yeah, or star fort. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Let's see here. So Bleak wants to know, how were relations with the Turks during the time of the Kingdom of Outremer, which I guess that would be earlier than the Ottoman period. But is that something you do much of, Sam, like Turks in the pre-Ottoman era?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely read about it because it is highly relevant. And I mean, the Turks really displace. I mean, they become the main military group in the Middle East. I mean, kind of. I guess a good analog would be like the Normans in Europe. You've got this kind of culture that is highly militarized, very effective, and then eventually they're able to kind of become the dominant power. But I think I don't know. I mean, I think your videos, you talk a lot about how the relations between the Turks and the Crusaders. It's highly variable. Sometimes the relations are good, and obviously there's also fighting. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I know that while, like, for example, during the Third Crusade, while Saladin was dealing with the Crusaders, he also had some issues with the Seljuk Turks he was trying to keep in line. So, yeah, definitely the Crusades are not ever just kind of this neat and tidy, Christians versus Muslims thing. I mean, you do always have conflict within religious lines, and you have in fact, I know one of the first big events that happens after the First Crusade is you have this spat between the Count of Odessa and the Prince of Antioch. So I guess at this time it was Tancred and I don't know, maybe this was a little bit later than that, but it was whoever was the ruler of Antioch at the time. And then it may have been Jocelyn of Odessa.
Mm-hmm.
And they each had different Turkish warlords who were in alliance with them. And
Yeah.
these Turkish warlords, were enemies themselves. And so it was kind of like, I mean, this is kind of the reality of how warfare worked in that theater. It's like, okay, well, I have a turf war with this guy has a turf war with this guy, and we're going to kind of fight it out. And I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because I think probably from both the perspective of Muslim and Christian chroniclers, they didn't really ever. There's a lot of unanswered questions there, I guess. Like, one wonders. I mean, the chroniclers are so geared toward presenting kind of the more proper narrative, I guess. Muslims should be fighting Christians, or Christians should be fighting Muslims. But one wonders kind of how these less convenient alliances worked. Like, did the Prince of Antioch, was he able to have a certain working relationship with certain Turkish warlords? And was that just like a normal part of how things were done for him, as opposed to this just being like some big anomaly? Like, well, we made a mistake. We made this alliance we never should have. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
yeah, because actually I got this book from the library. It's like Arab Chroniclers of the Crusades. I was looking through it, and like, yeah, it's like the Arab chroniclers. They're like highly scandalized when things like this happen.
Right.
But you can kind of read between the lines and be like, yeah, it's not. They got to do business with each other. I guess maybe this is corny, but I try to tell people, like, think about like mafia movies, how this stuff works. It's like, yeah, these people like hate each other, but they have to come to an agreement because they have some kind of mutual business interest. So
yeah,
it's
people who wield power, especially back then. I mean, people who were rulers and nobles and warriors. You're dealing in power, and it's like that's such a. I mean, how does one maintain power? Well, it's about balancing different forces against each other, and even exerting pressure on your allies. I mean, people will say, well, gee, why were the Count of Odessa and the Prince of Antioch fighting with each other? And
right.
The reality is, I mean, in a sense, because they were fighting didn't mean they weren't allies. I mean, it's like sometimes warrior aristocrats would settle things on the battlefield like that. It was just kind of the way it was done. And
yeah, I think it's like maybe a more meta issue with like the way people tend to think about history. It's like you can have multiple threads kind of going at once. And like, yeah, those two guys could be fighting each other and then turn around and still be able to say, okay, well, we have to go fight this Arab lord or this Turkish lord somewhere because it's also to our benefit. So yeah, it's always constant negotiation, and it's never neat and team A and team B and yeah, it's never like that.
But it is interesting how the chroniclers from both sides seem very interested to want to present it more like that, kind of like,
yeah,
it should be like this kind of thing. And I think part of that might be because the more literary type personalities were often associated with the religious, from the Christian side, they were religious. They were, monks, priests who wrote these chronicles often, especially during the early Crusades. And even from the Muslim side, I mean, these were often people who maybe had a more of a background in Quranic studies or, more of a religious type training. So,
yeah, definitely. I mean, like the main source for a lot of Arab history is a Tabari, who also compiled like the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad and his companions. So yeah, it was definitely part of the religious kind of establishment, because that's how you had to get an education at that time.
Okay, so, and we'll get to everybody's questions now. So Tom wants to know, what's the origin of the term Byzantine and Byzantium? That'd probably be a good one for Sam.
Yeah, my understanding is that it was developed in the 19th century. So this is kind of a debate among the Byzantinists, but the Byzantines themselves would call themselves like Romanoi at various times, or Greeks, depending on the period. But then Byzantium became a favored term by scholars like in the 1800s. So it's a modern kind of construction.
I believe the name of the city that was where Constantinople eventually would be, there was a town there called Byzantium or Byzantian or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that was the original name for Constantinople, and then it was, before it was changed,
quite a long time ago. Yeah,
and that was even, I think the name was obviously used before Constantine the Great. So Yeah, it was just adopted by scholars, which happens. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a lot of cultures that we have a name for that's not really what they would have used themselves.
And Alexander wants to know, how tolerant were the Ottomans to what kinds of Islam that differed from that of the Sultan? Maybe like different strains of Islam within the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, the extremely brutal, actually. There was very low toleration for Shi'is. So the Ottoman Empire the religious establishment was Sunni Muslim. And then the other larger sect of Islam is Shi'ism. And the Shi'is were seen as basically heretics, and they were typically persecuted quite heavily. Although in some situations, like you have some Shi'is that lived in Lebanon that were not really harassed or persecuted, but definitely in Anatolia, the Ottoman religious establishment in the state was not very friendly to non-Sunni Muslims, because their main competitor was the Safavid dynasty in Persia, and so this was seen as basically an enemy religion.
Okay. And we've got this is kind of an interesting question from Tom about Vlad the Impaler. Do you know much about Vlad the Impaler, Sam?
I've read a little bit, but no, I don't really know that much. I don't know if he considered himself a crusader. I think he was, but I think he was more. He led kind of more of a popular revolt, or at least that's how it's kind of presented against the Ottomans.
He was a member. He was a member of some kind of order of knighthood. I believe it was called the Order of the Dragon or something like that.
Okay.
In terms of calling him a crusader specifically, I'd kind of have to look up on that. I know as we get later, it's a little bit tougher to kind of determine who is a crusader and who isn't. It may be true that the Pope did, like, he may have participated in some papal bulls related to crusading. I'd have to look up on that. It's been a long time since I've done much reading on Vlad, but I actually have a question about that for you, Sam. Have you ever read anything about Ottoman perspectives on Vlad, or perspectives on his campaigns?
No, I haven't. I mean, I have some of the chronicles that would deal with that but I haven't actually looked at them in detail. So, but that would be interesting. I mean, but in general, so he was the voivode, the prince of Wallachia, right? Or
Right.
Moldova?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
So
that was I'm not going to say like where I think that was, because I don't want to offend anybody from that region. I know there's a lot of contesting in terms of if I say Hungarian or Romanian, I know I'll be saying the wrong thing. So.
Oh yeah. It's a feud that you don't want to get in the middle of. But anyway, so he was the voivode of Wallachia. So those Wallachia and Moldova were tributaries of the Ottoman Empire eventually. So they paid a tribute to the state, and then they had internal autonomy. But in terms of Vlad himself, I don't know too much, actually. So sorry about that.
Let's see. Chris wants to know if the Ottomans knew about the existence of the Americas.
Yes, they did. There is one Ottoman manuscript that is translation of some descriptions of the New World, actually. But the Ottomans did not really take much interest in the New World, as far as I know, just because they had enough going on, is the basic answer.
And let's see. Xenix wants to know what made a strong sultan. There seems to be a bunch of flip-flopping between Ottoman leaders that had on a leash on everyone compared to puppets controlled by court intrigue.
I think I get it. Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the context. I mean, what makes a strong sultan, in isolation. Uh, I guess I would say it came down to in the so the periods I mostly study, 16th and 17th century. It was basically having to balance all of the interest groups of the state, which meant the military, the ulama or the religious establishment, and to a certain extent, the commoners. So that was kind of the goal of the sultans, to keep all these groups happy. But the other thing to a lot of these sultans is like, doing the assassinations or, things like that. That was just normal. That was just how things got done. You know, but but another important thing also was, and the Ottoman writers discuss this a lot, is, making sure for the common people, for the peasantry, like taxation is just, the local officials are not overburdening, the commoners. So there is definitely an ideal of having justice and kind of a orderly state. I hope that's a good answer, Xenix.
All right. And this is kind of an interesting question from Tom. What European army did the Ottomans fear the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. Normally, the chroniclers don't really want to give anyone compliments. So they call, most of the time, if it's a European army, everyone's a Frank, and they're usually accursed, or they're dogs. A lot of these colorful insults.
So they still were using the term Franks quite a bit. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a real holdover from really the 12th, 13th centuries. So
Yeah, I mean, they'll use like national kind of identifiers, like, they'll say like Nemche, which is German, or they'll say Magyar, Hungarian. But when it's all of the Europeans kind of together, like this road source I'm working on, they call them Franks.
Okay. And Storymaker wants to know, why does it seem like every time the Turks in Anatolia suffered a disaster against the Mongols or others, they always recovered, but whenever the Byzantines faced the same happened, they lost land?
I think that's kind of, I think maybe sometimes when we read these things in books like that, then the Turks, seized all this land, especially in the pre-Ottoman period. It's not always quite true, because you have to keep in mind, like, in the late medieval period, so like the 13th and early 14th centuries, still most Turks are going to be nomads. So even if, like there's Turkish nomads in these areas, that doesn't always mean that they're really, like, there's a Turkish lord necessarily in control of it or something. And likewise, the Byzantines go through periods of recovery. Even at the end, in 1453, they did have a period of kind of recovery, but there was just a series of kind of historical contingencies that they ended up losing the siege. So yeah, it's always complicated, I guess. Because like after Manzikert, people say, oh, this is like what opens Anatolia to the Turks, but the Seljuk Empire is centered in Persia and parts of Central Asia. So Anatolia is really far away. And, like I said, they don't really settle, Turks after Manzikert don't really settle to the extent that people think they do after that. That's just an example.
Yeah, I think these ideas that these outcomes are inevitable in history, I think, can be a problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, I don't think, the destruction of the Byzantine Empire was any kind of inevitable thing. I mean, it could have carried on. I mean, I do think that something that you kind of were hinting at in discussing Anatolia is that one of the issues with the Turks was that they weren't really dependent on holding territory. Like
Right.
when the Byzantines would kind of recover and they would sort of push the Turks out of an area, they would just move their flocks somewhere else and still kind of be there. And there were a lot. I mean, Anatolia is so huge, and the big problem was always this northeastern area that the Byzantines could never fully get control over. And a lot of that, I think, just had to do with the nature of the Turks themselves. I mean, you know, again, yeah, they weren't reliant so much on having these traditional lordships. Even in the First Crusade, I mean, the Turks suffer a pretty big disaster in the First Crusade, but a lot of what they do as the First Crusade moves through is they just move away. They withdraw from these settled areas, and later, when the Byzantines are in decline again, they can occupy these areas again. So it's kind of an advantage that the Turks really had, that enabled them to kind of outlast the Byzantines in some respect.
Yeah, and I mean the Byzantine state was extremely resilient. I mean, and it was, I was reading a book recently. I think it's Warren Treadgold. The title escapes me right now, but is writing about the Byzantine recovery, like in the 8th and 9th centuries, under the Empress Irene. And it wasn't inevitable. It looked like the state could collapse, but there was a succession of emperors that were able to reform things and improve the society. So yeah, it's never inevitable, and when people say these dates, like after 1071, it was all over. I mean, it's just kind of doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, it looks decisive, but it wasn't necessarily at the time. I do think a big issue for the Byzantines after the death of Basil II was, once Anatolia went through kind of this traumatic period of these wars with the Turks, it was no longer feasible as this prime ground from which to raise the Byzantine army. And
yeah,
so
definitely.
So from then on, they're kind of dependent on mercenaries in a way that, you could say kind of there's something kind of decisive in that. They're no longer able to draw on their own military resources. I mean, and there were so many Turks in the Byzantine army. I mean, somebody like Alexius Comnenus, his army is pretty much made up of Normans and Franks and Turks. I mean, the people he's supposedly fighting. So
yeah, this is a great book on that. Yeah, Byzantium of the Turks, 13th century. And the book I was mentioning, but I couldn't remember, it's The Byzantine Revival, 780 to 842 by Warren Treadgold. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, but it's things like this that show how just important like human agency or free will is. I mean, it's never kind of preordained in the way that we tend to think.
And real quick, I just want to say, I think Sheila may have sent a super chat, I guess I should say power chat. I have been neglecting the power chat thing. I need to pull it up again and get it set up. I apologize, Sheila. If you could actually just, this is going to show how behind I am on my streaming thing. But Sheila, if you wouldn't mind just typing that in the main chat, we will get to it. But thank you for the contribution there, Sheila. So yeah, we'll get to that once Sheila types it out here in the main chat. But yeah, let's do a couple more questions, then we'll kind of close it down for today. You can see the chat there, right, Sam?
Yeah.
So why don't you pick out some questions?
Sure. I can deal with Lambert's question pretty quickly. What do Ottoman Chronicles say about the conquering of Rhodes? What are their attitudes toward the Hospitallers? Yeah, they call them, all these insulting names. Mostly call them Franks. They're always accursed. So Yeah, not very nice things, but they do. The Chronicle, the one I'm reading at least, is pretty accurate, showing that they've put up a pretty stiff resistance to the Ottomans.
Okay, and it looks like Sheila said that her super chat was just a thanks for the content and info. So thank you very much, Sheila. We appreciate that. All right, and then whatever other maybe let's do like 2 more questions.
Okay, there's Berzelmeyer here. Was Mahmud Pasha Angelovic really of Imperial Byzantine origin? Yeah, so a lot of the Ottoman ruling class over in the 15th century after the conquest of Constantinople is Byzantine nobility that become Muslim, and they just become absorbed into the Ottoman state, basically, which is, kind of might be confusing, but it is something that happened. They don't form into like some kind of faction because they just become assimilated. But and more generally, a lot of Ottoman elites are Balkan Slavic background. This is like the devshirme, the blood tax, that people know about. And that changes late 16th century, 17th century. That kind of diminishes somewhat, but yeah, a lot of Ottoman elites, let's say, have Slavic background.
Okay, and then how about one more question, and then we'll be good for today, I think.
Okay. I guess how did the Turks and the Mamluks get along after the fall of the Crusader states? Well, the Ottomans and the Mamluks become kind of enemies because they are competing kind of for the same frontier. So the Tarsus Mountains, which is in the southern part of Anatolia, and eventually the Ottomans conquer the Mamluks in 1517. But it's a pretty intense rivalry, and the early Ottoman period, so like the 14th century, they're fighting a lot of other Turkish lords in Anatolia. It's not always against the Byzantines or other Europeans.
All right. Okay, guys. Well, we appreciate you being here. It's always great to have Sam on. There's a lot of knowledge that he has just in terms of Ottoman history and that whole era related to Islam and the early modern period as we come out of the Middle Ages. So, yeah, Sam, thanks for being here. And we would like to have you on again to discuss this topic further. I feel like just like last time, there's definitely more to talk about. So
yeah, there's always a lot to discuss.
All right, cool. All right, everybody, join us again next Tuesday, this same time, and we'll do this again.